Title: Black Man Saves a Police Officer's Life. What happens next will leave you in tears. Chapter 1. The Fateful Night. James Carter, a hard-working mechanic, was on his way home after a long shift at Joe's Auto Repair. The cold night air bit at his skin as he walked past an alleyway on the east side of town. He had taken this route countless times before, but tonight something was different. A faint groan caught his attention. Curious and slightly wary, he stepped into the alley and saw a man lying on the ground. His uniform, though blood-stained and dirty, was unmistakable. It was a police officer. James hesitated for a moment, knowing how some officers treated black men like himself, but his conscience wouldn't let him walk away. "Hey, are you okay?" James asked, kneeling beside the officer. The man groaned again, his hand clutching his bleeding abdomen. "Shot! Back up! Call!" he whispered weakly. James quickly pulled out his phone and called 911. "I need an ambulance now. An officer's been shot. Alley off 5th and Main." Chapter 2. A Race Against Time. James ripped off his jacket and pressed it against the officer's wound to slow the bleeding. The officer, whose name tag read Richards, struggled to speak. Why help me?" he gasped. James frowned at the question but responded anyway. "Because you need help. That's all that matters right now." Minutes felt like hours as James applied pressure to the wound, keeping Richards awake. The sound of sirens finally filled the air, and soon paramedics and more officers arrived. James stepped back as the professionals took over, watching as they lifted the injured man onto a stretcher. A stern-looking officer approached James. "What happened here?" he demanded, his eyes filled with suspicion. James explained the situation, but he could feel the distrust lingering in the air. "I was just walking home when I heard him groaning. He was bleeding out, so I called 911 and tried to help." The officer studied him for a moment before nodding curtly. "We'll need you to come to the station to give a full statement." James sighed but agreed. He had done the right thing, but something told him this wasn't over. Chapter 3. Gratitude and Suspicion. At the police station, James repeated his story. Some officers seemed skeptical, but a detective named Lieutenant Avery appeared more understanding. A few hours later, James was finally free to go, but not before he heard an officer mutter, "Must have been his gang buddies who shot Richards." The words stung, but James kept his head high. Days passed and James tried to return to his normal routine. Then one afternoon his phone rang. "Mr. Carter, this is Officer Richards." James was surprised but answered cautiously. "Yes. I just wanted to say, thank you. You saved my life." James hesitated before replying. "You're welcome. Just did what anyone should do." There was silence on the other end before Richards spoke again. "Not everyone would have helped me." Chapter 4. The Truth Comes Out. Richards, still recovering, began looking into the incident himself. The more he investigated, the clearer it became. This wasn't a random attack. It was a setup. He had been targeted by dirty cops who wanted him out of the way. Feeling indebted to James, he decided to reach out again. "James, I need your help," he admitted. "This wasn't random. Someone wanted me dead, and I think it's someone in the department." James wasn't sure what to say. Helping someone in need was one thing. Getting involved in police corruption was another. But as he thought about it, he realized he had already taken a risk that night. "If I help, I want your word that the truth will come out," James said firmly. Richards agreed. Otter Chapter 5. Exposing Corruption. Over the next few weeks, Richards and James worked together, gathering evidence. The deeper they dug, the darker the truth became. Some officers were involved in illegal activities, and Richards had been on their radar for trying to clean up the force. One night, James and Richards met in secret at an abandoned warehouse to discuss the final pieces of evidence they had gathered. Just as they were going over everything, headlights flooded the space. A group of masked men stepped out of unmarked police vehicles, weapons drawn. "Looks like you've been busy, Richards," a voice sneered. It was Captain Monroe, someone Richards had once trusted. James and Richards exchanged a glance. They were trapped. Chapter 6. The Standoff. "You don't have to do this," Richards said, stepping forward, his hands raised. Monroe laughed coldly. You were supposed to be dead that night, but this idiot, he pointed at James, messed up our plans. James clenched his fist but stayed silent. You're both dead men, Monroe continued, cocking his gun. But before he could pull the trigger, sirens blared in the distance. Richards had tipped off internal affairs earlier. Within seconds, federal agents swarmed the warehouse, catching Monroe and his men off guard. A firefight ensued, and by the end of the night, the corrupt officers were in custody. Chapter 7. Justice and Redemption. Richards testified in court, exposing Monroe and the corrupt officers. Thanks to the evidence, they were sentenced to prison. James was recognized as a hero, his bravery changing not just one life, but an entire police department. The media covered the story extensively, and James was offered several job opportunities. But instead of taking a corporate offer, he used his newfound platform to advocate for police reform and racial equality. One evening, Richards visited James at his garage. I owe you everything, he said, extending his hand. James shook it. We owe each other. Richards nodded. You saved my life. Now I want to spend the rest of mine making things right. They stood in silence for a moment, two men from different worlds brought together by fate. And for the first time in a long time, both felt hopeful, not just for themselves, but for the world around them.